Department with the City of Charlotte. And we also have additional staff on the call. I'll just introduce them by name. So Alberto Gonzalez, Kathy Cornett, Erin Hinson, all with the Planning Department. And then we've got Tracy Newsom with CDOT. And outside external participants are Denny, Joanna, and Jeff, and we'd like to welcome you. Today, we're going to be covering the Charlotte Future 2040 Policy Map and then the Charlotte Streets Map as it relates to the north, middle, and outer geographies of the city. Just a little housekeeping, just reminders on the virtual meetings. If we can make sure that we're participating on a desktop, we have some interactive exercises later on, and it's more helpful if you're on your desktop. If you can mute your audio when you're not speaking, that's so we don't get any feedback. And if you can only use one source of audio, it helps keep the conversation clear. If you are on your phone, if you can do not put your phone on hold. And just a reminder, this meeting is going to be recorded and the chats will be saved at the end of each session, and that's for record keeping. This is a very intimate group, but please remember to be respectful when other folks are speaking. That's just so that we're capturing the conversation clearly. So on today's agenda, the meeting will be split into two broken down into two parts. The first is an informational meeting overview, and what we'll cover is what the purpose of the Charlotte Future 2040 Policy Map and the Streets Map is, how the two draft maps relate to one another, and what the actual draft maps are. We'll actually take a look at those. And then in the community conversation, we will be reviewing the draft 2040 policy map recommendations for the specific geography. So we'll get to look at specific areas in this geography. We'll discuss any additional steps that may be needed for the mapping approach, and then any adjustments that we may need to think about for the mapping approach that we've come up with. So what is the purpose of the 2040 policy map and the streets map? In a nutshell, they are, along with the Unified Development Ordinance, intended to implement the vision for the future Charlotte Future 2040 Comprehensive Plan, which was adopted in June of 2021. And that is the vision for our growth for the city through the year 2040. The 2040 policy map identifies locations for future growth in the city. The streets map identifies the vision for mobility within the city. And then the Unified Development Ordinance consolidates all development regulations as they align with the 2040 policy map. And how do these maps relate to one another? So in the most simplest sense, they both inform the built environment. From a land use and building form perspective, the 2040 policy map guides where growth should happen and in what form. And then the streets map gives us a vision for what the mobility needs to look like to move from one place to another. And that includes pedestrians and automobiles alike. So before we get into the two maps, and we'll concentrate today mostly on the policy map, but we do want to give you an overview of what the streets map is. We need to define what a street is and what we mean by a street. So this graph that you see here shows what we mean when we say a cross section, which is regulated by the streets map. It's important to note that these are components found in streets. Not all these components are found in every street, but most streets include a combination of the components that you see. So if you read the screen from left to right, the first that you see is your center space, and those are spaces intended to protect, give a pedestrian a protected area to cross a wide street, or for cars to be able to make left turns. Typically, your turn lanes are found there. Then you have your travel lanes, which most streets have. Those that's what you think of when you think of a street. So most streets will have a travel lane, if not all. Some streets will have your bicycle facilities, not necessarily in the location shown on this shot, but if they do have it and it's a wider street like depicted, it will be as depicted in the screen. Your curb and gutter, and sometimes on-street parking, and then your planting strips and your pedestrian facilities. Sometimes the pedestrian facilities, like your sidewalks, and the bicycle facilities are combined into a multimodal path, and those are typically your wider sidewalks, 10 feet or more. And then what the streets map is not, it is not a project's priorities map list. So you won't find things like what your priority projects are or what the timing or funding of those are. So what is the Charlotte Streets Map? It is the map vision for the Charlotte Future Multimodal Street Network. It's one of the key implementation tools for the UDO, and it shows expected multimodal cross sections, again, for all arterials within the city. You won't find your local roads. These are mostly arterials. And it includes your street classifications. So is it a boulevard, an avenue, or a main street? It'll tell you the number of lanes and whether or not it has a bike facility. And we have designed an online application, online comment application for both the Charlotte, the 2040 Policy Map, and then the Streets Map. And we can drop the link to that on in the chat, but basically it's to collect information on what you think about the draft maps. When you open up the application, you'll find your comment buttons to the left, and then if you click on one of the comment buttons, it'll bring up a comment box. You'll fill out your fields, and then you hit save. And essentially what we're trying to capture is, do you agree with the recommendations that are given for a specific street or a specific place type? And we'll get into what a place type is a little bit later on in the presentation. If you need a step-by-step guide on how to comment, we have a demonstrational video in both Spanish and English, and you can also find that in the on our website, and Erin will drop a link to that as well in the chat. So moving on to the focus of today's presentation is, what is the Charlotte Future 2040 Policy Map? It is a translation of the comprehensive plan's place-based policies for specific geographies. And it provides citywide direction for balancing the future needs and opportunities. It is intended to protect priorities while providing growth for opportunity, or opportunity for growth. It is intended to align the future growth with where infrastructure exists and improve access to historically underserved areas. So how did we develop this map? We developed the map using a new tool called Place Type, and using a 3-step process, applying that tool in a 3-step process approach. So place types are designated to provide guidance for the mix and proportion of land use. They're intended to take the place of what we currently call future land use. Place types include building forms and design, options for mobility and parking, and then your open space. By comparison, if you compare that with just what we call land use only typically gives you a designation, so commercial, residential, and then maybe a guide for how dense a place can be, so either low, medium, or high density. So place types are a lot more comprehensive in that sense. And then the 3-step approach that we took, and we will, I'll break these steps down as the presentation goes along, but in a nutshell, we mapped 3 different sets of sort of policies. The first was to map the existing development. So that's development as it exists today on the ground. We then overlaid the adopted policies, which were the policies that we have in the adopted community area plans. And those are policies in place since 2010. And then the last set of policies that we mapped were the Charlotte Future 2040 policies that were adopted in the comprehensive plan this year. So there are 10 place types that were adopted in the comprehensive plan, and they're categorized by places where we live, work, and play. And we'll go into each one of these so that you understand the colors on the map a little bit more. But essentially, the places where we live are neighborhoods 1 and 2, and then the places adjacent to where we live are usually the parks and preserves. The places where we typically work are commercial areas, campuses, innovation and mixed use, and then manufacturing and logistics. And then the places where we play, and that play typically includes not just where you go for recreation, but also where you go for shopping and restaurants and entertainment. But those typically include the neighborhood center, your community activity centers, and then your regional activity centers. So your neighborhood 1 and 2 are your traditional neighborhoods. Neighborhood 1 is the lower density housing, where you find most of your single family detached, or your smaller multifamily, or your additional dwelling units, accessory dwelling units, excuse me. Your neighborhood 2, you can find a little bit higher density. So your apartment buildings and your townhomes are typically found in neighborhood 2. And your neighborhood center are typically small, walkable, and mixed use areas that have convenient access to goods, services, dining, and other amenities for residents. Your parks and preserves are just that. They're protected public parks and open spaces. And then your community centers are typically a little bit larger, or larger than your neighborhood center, but mid-size in the grand scheme of things. And they are typically found along transit corridors and major roadways. And again, they include things such as goods and services, dining, and entertainment. Your commercial areas are what you think of when you think of primarily car-oriented areas for retail. Think about the older strip malls, things that aren't really integrated and just are sort of standalone commercial areas. Your campus is typically a group of buildings and public spaces that serve an institution. So think of your hospitals, your universities, or the office parks. Innovation mixed use are areas that are typically used for employment in older urban areas, such as light manufacturing, your studios, your research, and some may include retail and dining. Manufacturing and logistics are typically employment areas, and they usually have wage levels in sectors such as production, manufacturing, and then distribution and logistics. So when I think about this, I think about your Amazons. And then your regional activity center are usually the larger high density mixed use areas, typically along your transit corridors and major roadways. And these are really intended to attract a regional patron. So how was the 2040 policy map developed? Again, this is the 3-step process that I covered briefly before. We mapped the existing development, and the inputs for that are the existing land uses, so what's on the ground today, and then the forms of development. We used that as a reference point to then overlay the adopted policies. So we used the future land use, which is what we use now to to figure out what density and intensity a place is adequate for. We use zoning as an input for that, and then market support. And then the final step was to map the 2040 comprehensive plan policies. And the inputs for that were the equitable growth framework, which I'll explain what that is. The the actual policies in the plan, and then survey responses that we got during the first phase of engagement for this mapping project. And then we checked our work by looking at our growth projections, which we'll also look at later on in the presentation, and looking at where there is infrastructure and environmental capacity to actually develop land, as well as market feasibility. So going back to the growth, equitable growth framework, that is a sort of a set of policies or inputs that we look at, and what they are taken in the context of looking at 4 areas where we want to make sure that we provide equity. And those 4 areas are housing, employment, goods and services, and then environmental justice. And the maps that we'll look at today are in that context. So getting into the actual geography, this is the north middle outer, and you can see it's at the northern end of the city, bound on the west by 77, on the south by 85, and just spilling over north of 485. So now we'd like to take a look at the first 2 steps that we took in coming up with the 2040 draft policy map. And that's by looking at the existing development and then looking at the adopted policies that we mapped. So the first map you see is what we used as a base, and this is the existing development. Again, if you remember, the inputs for this were the existing land use and what's on the ground, existing development, basically. So just taking a general look at what the colors are. Again, you see a lot of yellow, which is your neighborhood 1. You see a lot of that purple color on the left-hand side of the screen, which is your manufacturing and logistics. And then you see some teal in the middle, sort of in the middle of the map, which is your campus. So that's what's on the ground today. When we overlaid the adopted policies, and that's your our community area plans that exist since 2010, this is the map that we get. So this is the map this is what would happen to the city if we did absolutely nothing and just moved forward with the adopted plans that we have as of 2010 today. And you can see what the effect on that map is. We have an increase of a neighborhood 1 land area. We have a decrease in parks and preserve, commercial, campus, and then manufacturing and logistics. And then we have an increase in innovation mixed use, your neighborhood centers, and then your community activity center. So now we'd like to take a look at the next sort of set of maps, which is if we, taking into account the 2040 policies and the 2040 draft policy map that comes after we map those policies over the adopted policies. The first set of policies is preservation policies. And really what these are more of, if you think of protection more than preservation, that's probably a more accurate description. So those policies set to protect your neighborhood 1, your manufacturing and logistics, and then your parks and preserve. Those were sort of priority areas identified in the plan. And you can see what that looks like. When we actually map those policies, you can see there's actually a slight decrease in neighborhood 1, but there's an increase in manufacturing and logistics, and then your parks and preserve increased by 10 and 34% respectively. And now we'd like to, we do have some polling questions just to capture your feedback and gauging on whether or not you agree that these steps are adequate for actually protecting community assets and actually furthering the goals of the 2040 comprehensive plan. So I'll read the question, and if Erin, you can launch the the poll, that would be great. So the first question is around the preserving neighborhood 1 and parks and preserve. And the question is, the mapping step to preserve neighborhood 1 and parks and preserve aligns with the Charlotte Future 2040 plan's direction to protect community assets. Do you agree with that or not? Do you agree that this step actually preserves and protects community assets? And Erin, once we get the participants to answer the questions, if you can close it and then just share the results, that'd be great.
We have one participant answered. I'll give it another 3 seconds or so. Can you all see the results?
Do you mind reading them, Erin?
Yeah, that's fine. I'm getting an error on my end, so I'm not sure if they're displaying, but I'll read them. Okay. It looks like one participant agrees and one participant is neutral.
Okay, great. Thank you for participating. We have a few more questions in this sort of section of the presentation, so I'll go through that. So next we want to cover the equitable growth framework. And remember, we said that that includes 4 areas where we want to make sure that equity exists. The first is housing, which we'll cover with this slide. Then we have employment, goods and services, and then environmental justice. So let's get into the access to housing opportunity. So this map displays where access to housing gaps exist. So anything outside of the hatched area is where there's gaps in the access to housing. And the metrics that we use to determine that are, the housing unit diversity. So, whether you have single family, multifamily, condos and things like that. The cost of housing, housing size, access to subsidized housing, tenure, and then level of reinvestment in your housing stock. So when we look at this map, anything outside of, again, the hatched area is where the gaps exist. When we mapped the 2040 policies over that, the sort of way to mitigate or increase your access to housing was to increase your neighborhood 2. And you can see that, you can see the effect of that on this map. Let me just go back. If you look at the starting map and then the resulting map after mapping the 2040 policies, you can see that the orange are added areas to increase access to housing, as we just described in the metrics before. So we have a follow-up question to that, and it's along the same lines. This is the resulting map so that you get a better picture of what that looks like. We have a follow-up question, and it is whether or not this mapping neighborhood 2 in areas with low access to housing opportunity is a good approach to increasing housing diversity in the future. So do you agree that mapping neighborhood 2 in areas where there's low access to housing is a good approach and actually increases housing diversity in the future?
Gretchen, I apologize. I'm receiving an error on my end.
Okay, let me see if I can
another poll
it.
has started. We may have issues with the other meeting in progress. I'm not sure.
All right.
Maybe best to put it in the chat.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you, Kathy. If you'd like to participate, if you agree or disagree, you can feel free to put it in the chat. And we'll give folks a few seconds to do that.
I'm actually having a hard time getting into the chat, but I would, for Jeff, you can put agree if that helps.
Okay. Thank you. We appreciate that. And feel free. This isn't sort of a really intimate group, so we can make it as informal as you like. Okay. So now looking at access to employment opportunity. This again is the starting point, the starting map that we started with, and anything outside of the hashed area is where access to employment gaps exist. And the metrics that we used for that were proximity to employment, employment in commute shed, so how far from or where employment exists in relation to where people are living, wage levels, middle skilled jobs, and then knowledge-based jobs. So the comparison of the two. Okay. And when we mapped the policies from the 2040 comp plan, what we saw was a decrease in campus. But in addition, if you can see on here, this is additional innovation mixed use. And that was added with the 2040 policy mapping. And that is, that's really envisioned to be a place where people go to find employment. Oops, sorry. And this is what the resulting map looks like. So again, we have a follow-up question to this, and it is mapping campus and innovation mixed use in an area with low access to jobs a good approach to increasing job access in the future? And you can feel free to either unmute yourself or share your thoughts. I think the group is small enough where we can just chat about this if you'd like.
Again, this is Jeff. I would answer the narrow question, yes.
Okay.
I did want to mention, if I can I make a comment, just a question?
Yes, absolutely. Yes.
I noted the innovation mixed use that you pointed to, I believe, sort of closer to the county line. And one of the things I thought was helpful is proximity to employment, where employment exists in middle skill jobs. The one thing that I wondered is, as a general proposition, and actually more narrow in this instance, I am focused on a piece of property, that did you take into consideration activities and uses that are just over the county line, for example? Because I do think that's something that there are going to be some instances, and you also mentioned innovative mixed use area that up near Concord, there is the Concord Mills Mall and all those activities just over the county line, and yet the maps understandably seem to just stop there and not really recognize that the proximity to employment already is pretty good. I agree 100% that an innovation mixed use, or frankly, what I'm looking at, and I think folks on the call probably know, is conscious of a manufacturing logistics with employment and housing. So I don't want to bog everybody down because I know you got a lot to cover, but I just wanted to point that out.
No, that's a very good point. Thank you for pointing that out. So from a technical perspective, you're right that the map stops at the county line, because this is only mapping for Charlotte, for the city of Charlotte. And it does not go over into Cabarrus, because we don't have jurisdiction into Cabarrus. But I want to say that the methodology did look at just the surrounding area, and that, I don't want to misspeak, and we can certainly get back to you on this, but some of that market feasibility, I believe, includes some of those analyses. So we can, if you'd like more information, we can certainly get you what you need. I think we have your contact from the registration, so we can certainly get you that. But you're right that the map itself stops at the county line, and that's because we don't have jurisdiction into Cabarrus County.
Got it. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Okay. So the next set of sort of policies that we look at are access to essential amenities, goods, and services. And that, I'm sorry. So this is, again, if you look at the hatched area, anything outside of it is where your gaps exist. And the metrics for those are, you know, what's your proximity to childcare and education, parks and open space, where do those exist? Community facilities, your access to fresh foods, healthcare, and then your financial services, and also access to internet service, because the further out you get, the spottier service gets. So when we overlay the policies, this is what we find. We have a reduction in the older commercial, the older sort of single-use isolated commercial, but we have an increase in neighborhood centers, which when you think about it, that's where most people get their services and goods, typically in areas very close to their house where they can, you know, go to the grocery store, go to the pharmacy, drop their kids off at school, or for childcare. So the resulting map looks like this. I'm sorry, that's the resulting map. Apologies. And then, so the follow-up question to that is mapping activity centers in area with low access to goods and services a good approach to increasing access to those goods and services in the future? So it sort of follows the same line of question as the previous ones. And again, it's a small group, so you can feel free to unmute or drop it in the chat.
Again, an agree on my end.
Okay. And the last is environmental justice. So what this is anywhere where there is no hatching is where there are gaps in environmental justice. And the things that we look at are, you know, what's the tree canopy in these areas? What's the impervious surface? What's the proximity to heavy industrial use, and what are the uses around it? Proximity to major transportation infrastructure, and then the effects on the floodplain. And so this is the resulting map of that. This is basically where we have opportunity for to have some environmental justice in areas where there is no hatching. And this is the last question in this set of polling questions: is how important is it to explore additional tools to further mitigate environmental justice impacts during the community area planning process? And Erin, if you can drop the choices in the chat, because they're they may be a little bit different. So is it very important, important, neutral, unimportant, or very unimportant to map, to explore additional tools for environmental justice as we get into the community planning area process?
I maybe say important. I would think important, but I would need to kind of get a little bit more sense of how it would be done. So I may put a bill as a result.
Sure. And that, you know, that's really going to be explored in the community area planning process that happens after the policy map is adopted. And I believe after the UDO is adopted, that would be our next step, is getting into the community planning areas and really delving into these types of issues, because it may be different from one area to the other.
Right.
Okay. So let's look at the growth allocations that we alluded to earlier in the presentation. So these are growth projections for housing and jobs in this specific geography, and then we compare that to the rest of the city. So for this specific geography, the projected growth for housing units is a little over 14,400 units, and that makes up around 10%. So this community planning area makes up around 10% of the city's sort of geography. So, I mean, what that means really is that around 14,400 jobs are going to go into around 10% of the city overall. And then in terms of jobs, we see a little, just a little over 8,000 jobs going into this geography, or projected to go into this geography as the city grows, which is around 4% of the citywide number. So we have two more interactive exercises to get through. And the first one is really to...
Can I ask a question real quick?
Yes, go ahead.
I apologize, I don't want to bog you down. So is it fair to draw a conclusion based on the data that close to 15,000 or 10% of housing households in the geography we're talking about making up of the city, but only with 8,000 jobs, 4% of the jobs, which would lead you to believe that more jobs in this area might make sense to match up, to be near where the households are. Is that sort of how things are being viewed, or is that too simplistic?
That may be a little oversimplifying it.
Okay.
I think in order to make that connection, we would probably have to take a look at what the numbers for the overall city are saying. What this pie chart is showing is that this community planning area is 10% of the city, basically.
10% of the geography or 10% of the households?
Of the households.
Okay.
The household growth, basically.
Got it. Okay.
Yeah. Okay, so the next set of exercises, our objective is to collect your feedback on the mapping approach and maybe some potential revisions to the draft map. We understand that our approach is just a starting place, and we may need additional steps to either correct or adjust some of the mapping to better align with the comprehensive plan. So the next exercise will gear it toward that. So parcel specific edits that do not align with additional steps or adjustments to the mapping approach won't be incorporated, and that's because place types aren't meant to be parcel specific. They're meant to be block wide. So in that sense, it's a little bit more comprehensive than just your typical land use, which does usually look at just a parcel by parcel analysis. So we've heard from some of our stakeholders that some of the existing manufacturing and logistics sites, especially those closer to uptown, may be better suited for other uses due to the needs of the manufacturing industry. And our question here is it more important to preserve existing manufacturing and logistics sites, or to consider where repurposing those areas may be better served, may better serve other community needs in the future? So are we saying that manufacturing and logistics sites are more important to preserve, or or repurposing those areas to better serve other community needs in the future? And I believe Erin has dropped the choices in the chat.
I guess my response would be that, just be honest, I think there's a third component, which would be, it seems to me there is, I think it's important to repurpose a number of these areas, but at the same time, as a macro level, I think the manufacturing industrial study reflects that we still need to retain and grow our manufacturing and logistics sites. And so I think the third choice would be it seems to be there's some areas that it probably makes sense to repurpose, but we need to do that in a manner in which we also find places where it can be increased.
So maybe, if I'm hearing you correctly, what it sounds like is that maybe in areas where manufacturing currently exists, it may not be appropriate to leave those uses there, but maybe find another location where they are more appropriate and find a way.
Yeah,
of-
I know this is a broad question. I know this is a broad question, and
Yeah.
Alberta, others that know who I am on the phone. It's a very broad question. It's a great question. I do think this is when you start getting into not specific sites, but specific areas. So
Right.
it's hard to just kind of make the sweeping. I personally think we should repurpose a number of those older areas, particularly the ones that go back and they're just kind of in a disreputable place.
Mhm.
But I think the study work would say we also need to create more spots in the appropriate locations.
That.
Sorry.
No. This is great input. This is exactly the type of input that we're hoping to get with this exercise. Okay. The next question is, we've also heard we know that there's a lot of large single-family lots located along major transportation corridors in the city. And these sites could have eventually evolved to neighborhood 2 to provide more housing options in the future, as we saw with the mapping exercise that we did earlier, where neighborhood 2 was one way to get more housing options. In your opinion, is it more important to preserve existing single-family lots or provide more housing options along major corridors?
I would think the assumption is a lot of these are, as you say, large single-family lots. And with that description, it seems to me that this providing greater housing options and choices and supports the mobility metrics. And therefore, I would say evolving to neighborhood 2 on this makes sense.
Yeah, that's correct. And with the neighborhood 2, you can have single family, but you also have the smaller lots, and then you have your townhomes and your apartment buildings.
Yep.
Okay. And the last of these is regarding commercial uses. A lot of the existing commercial development doesn't align with the comp plan in terms of providing walkable and integrated communities, since they're typically older, isolated, single-use commercial. The question is, how important is it that commercial places in the community planning areas evolve into neighborhood activity centers? So how important is it that they go from sort of the single-use commercial to the more integrated neighborhood activity centers where you find a mix of uses?
Yeah, I believe that my sense is that encouraging residential within some of these single-use commercial areas moves the needle to where you then will bring more services and retail. The residential will help drive the market to do more smaller retail and smaller services, whether it's medical or otherwise, as opposed to just allowing some of these areas just to kind of stay one type of use. So it seems to make sense to me.
Thank you for that. That's really very helpful feedback to hear that. Okay. And then the last exercise that we have is adjustments to a mapping approach. And this is where we really look at the specific map for this geography and talk about, are there any adjustments that we think need to be made? And this exercise is an annotated exercise. Because we only have one participant left on the call, I wonder if it's just easier to just take a look at the map and maybe talk through any areas that you might want to discuss, and we'll capture that. The video is being recorded anyway, so we'll capture it. But is there a specific area that you maybe want to take a look at, maybe talk about a little bit on the map? I know you talked about, we were talking about the manufacturing and logistics and where that may make sense to either expand in some areas or repurpose in some areas. There's a good amount of that on this map. Are these areas any areas of concern at all?
No, you're kind. And again, I feel very selfish being the only person on the call and responding, but And Kathy and Alberto, this is Jeff Brown. I think I do a fair amount of the land use stuff. So I think the only thing I feel like there's so many good things that y'all put out today, and that's why I think I supported most of all the initiatives. The one area there is something that's sort of immediate that's frankly comes to my mind, and that is the area, as I mentioned, up along Concord. It's the innovation and mixed use area as it relates to this manufacturing logistics. And it's everybody probably maybe knows we have a pretty significant rezoning that's coming there. I'm not on the call myopically for just that purpose, I promise you, but others may disagree with that. But no, I really wanted to see the process. That's one area where the market study aspects I think should be brought to bear as well, because that location does seem to me to beg for more employment near where people live. And that includes also being close to services across the Concord line. And then at the same time, it's not a place where we haven't talked about displacement concerns, where you do more manufacturing and logistics or innovation for that matter in places where people live and you're having trucks go through people's neighborhoods. This is a kind of a unique, accessible location that would allow the ability for access onto the interstate, and then to serve that same, if you look at the purple area, that purple area is built out. There's no more manufacturing logistics there. So this does give you a chance to do that. And we've had conversations with the staff in that regard. Beyond that, the only other thing is, again, this county line element. I do think, even though it's a different jurisdiction, and I'm not just thinking in this location, I think of other places where you'll be bumping up against Mint Hill, more on the east side. You'll be bumping up to other jurisdictions. The jurisdiction doesn't matter. It's whether the services exist across the line for the purposes of the walkability, ultimate walkability, and ultimately allowing people to drive 2 minutes versus 20 minutes.
Right. And that's a really good point. It's something that we've heard previously, and we're certainly we're taking that feedback and inputting it into this process. And all of the comments that we get through these presentations, the online application, common application, those are all being sort of synthesized and analyzed, and where we can make adjustments, we take that into account.
The only other thing I said, it does look like to me that the acknowledgement of the Centene world there, the campus and campus activity centers, all that makes great sense. Does that kind of, it just seems to me that's appropriate, and that what has been occurring. But there's so much yellow, otherwise it's hard in just kind of one setting to really sort of see what other gaps or gores there may be. But anyway, it's been interesting. I appreciate the opportunity to be a part of it.
Good, absolutely. Yeah, we have next steps, just so that you're aware. We have this phase that goes through November 10th. Our online comment application is open through November 14th. And then we anticipate having a second draft of the Charlotte Future 2040 Policy Map by early 2022. So that's sort of our intended timeline right now.
Got it. One last comment I might make, not to this area, but there are a few places where I think the mapping may have come out. It's tricky because I think you said the policy guidelines will go back to 2010.
Yeah, the adopted area plans.
Versus going back even further, because some places don't have anything more recent than that go back farther. And then this is a tough area, and I know it's kind of a narrow comment, but there are some of these things that haven't been adopted policy, but had things called the development responses, whether it's out on 485 or in various locations, that I don't think those were factored into the formula, and understandably so. They aren't adopted policy, so I can see why the formula may not have picked up some of those. But to the extent that over time, it's a big, tall ask and a lot to ask of the good folks who've been working on this. But over time, there may be some places where larger acreage that had a planning process, even though it wasn't adopted policy, to try to identify those and maybe update the maps accordingly. And I think Alberto and Kathy, who are online, I think know there are 4 or 5 of those that have been received some community attention, even though they weren't adopted. But people are making land use decisions a little bit based on those processes. So anyway, thank you.
Well, thank you for, for being with us today. We really appreciate your feedback. And if you have any questions, you know how to find us. You can either email us or go to our online comment application and just, if you come up with anything else, you're more than welcome to do that.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Have a great day.
Bye, y'all. Thank you.
Bye.
Hey, Jeff, thank you. Thanks for participating.
Appreciate it, Alberta. Take care of yourself. Bye-bye.
Yeah.
Bye.